Unprecedented times.
You know, we've all said it, but precedented times are nice. I would think to go back to some precedented times.
Everyone, we are recording this on Sunday, an hour and a half after President Biden decided he wasn't going to run for office again. So it's going to be a ride, I guess.
I think a lot about how our podcast is going to be inadvertently a little bit of a time capsule for our times, but also for my life. And I just don't know. I you know what? Here's what I will say, because who knows how anything's going to work out, but I do feel energized.
Me too.
And I feel hopeful.
Me too.
In a way that I have not. I was going to just close my eyes and vote, right? Okay, I don't want to live under fascism, but now.
Right, blew down the line.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's exciting.
Here's where I'm at. I felt a tremendous amount of relief when it happened, because it feels like this is the way the party moves forward. And this is going to galvanize so many people to get interested this year. And I've been saying from the beginning, the goal here was not winning minds and hearts. People were going to vote for who they were going to vote for. The goal was getting people to the polls, getting people excited about walking into their polling precincts and pulling the lever. And this is exciting. I'm a nerd, and I was not going to watch the convention. And
talk about the convention.
No, listen, did you know that I worked at the DNC during the Kerry Bush election, 2024. It's still my
2004.
I'm sorry, 2004. We're doing it again. No, in 2004, I worked at the Kerry DNC in Boston. And when I tell you, delegates, no one loves the party.
I'm sure.
Love the party.
I'm sure.
I mean, and we saw this a little bit this last week with the people wearing the bandages over their ears at the RNC. With love to anyone out there who is a delegate, you all know that you're all a little bit crazy. And they do a lot of I know it's in Chicago. And first of all, so they wear hats. There's a lot of buttoning and flares and excitement. And then they do things just scream the candidates' names just at random. But anyway, so knowing that, I'm going to watch every single second of the convention. Because now I'm excited. I'm okay, they're going to trot out the greatest minds of our generation to say whatever they're going to say. And the West Wing fan in me this morning was very opposed to Aaron Sorkin, but today I am much happier with just the idea of a big DNC.
Okay, that's fine. But yeah, Aaron Sorkin,
No, he can eat a dick.
Listen,
Can I say that on this podcast?
Say whatever we want on this podcast. But he gets no pleasure out of it. Okay, so anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome, everyone, to Fated Mates.
There you go.
We are not a political podcast. We are a romance novel podcast.
Romance is political, everybody.
Yeah, exactly. All books are political. But I'm Sarah McLean. I read romance novels. And I write them.
And I'm Jennifer Prokop, a romance reader and editor. And I will say one last thing before we move on, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who are I don't want to talk about this because I'm hyperventilating for whatever reason. We will be phone banking again. And we are not really gearing up probably until the fall. But you can sign up if you are interested in joining or getting emails about sort of scheduling and sort of being, that way you don't have to watch social media. We will go right to your inbox. And you can do that by going to fatedmates.net/fatedstates. And that is where we will be collecting information. And then when we're ready to let you know our schedule, once we kind of work with Indivisible, you will be hearing from us and you can join our phone banks. So
we are super excited. I am not feeling sick to my stomach at all. I'm feeling really excited. I'm ready to fight. I'm ready to do the job. And I got to say, as the fall gets, closer and longer until the beginning of November, these phone banks can really help ground us as like in the moments of what can I do? How can I help? Like I'm panicking, being able to get on the phone and make some calls and talk to voters and feel at the end of 2 hours like you have done the job, you have done what you can. It feels really good. What I would also add is that these are also super fun. The way they run is Jen and I host them. We are there from the beginning of the call. We do a little banter at the beginning for everyone, and then everyone gets trained on the phone banking. And then we phone bank for like 30 minutes to 40 minutes. And then we usually have a fun visitor at a break. We give away books, we give away prizes, people chat the whole time in the chat box. There's book recommenders. Last year, was it Melanie Green who invented the book recommender?
There was like a funny there's a bingo card usually. So yeah, we'll have a lot of fun phone banking.
It's
everybody.
we try to make it as fun as possible. And you get to hang out with us.
Yeah. And I think phone banking can be super intimidating to people, but it is also pretty well established as being one of the like interventions, right, that moves the needle the most.
Yep.
Far more than writing postcards, more than text banking. Phone banking is very effective because you're talking to a real human. Stuff. So anyway, if you're at all like, I don't know what to do or I'm scared to do it, we will hold your hand and help you through it. And we will talk more about it, I'm sure, as we get closer. So if you're looking to join up with the Fated States phone banking, we're ready to go. We're going to do it.
We're getting going soon.
Yeah.
And then also in 2020, and I think we'll bring it back this year, we did one live episode where we did a deep dive on Julie Garwood books while people wrote postcards to voters in swing states. And that was really fun. So we got a bunch of things cooking. Stick with us. Fated States is back. We just need to get ourselves organized.
Yeah, Fated States 2024, Electric Boogaloo, whatever. I don't know. I can't do it.
But Jen, today we're here to talk about a different kind of ballot.
Amazing. Well done.
There's all sorts of talking in romance right now, and we're going to ignore a lot of it. But one of the things that I want to talk about, because it's personal, is the New York Times 100 best books of the 21st century. So if you haven't heard about this, great. But what happened was a few months ago, the editors of the New York Times Book Review got together and they said, we're going to do a best list, a 100 best books list. And the problem with doing 100 best books of, all time is it's all the same books right up
always
there at the
right
top,
yeah,
right. It's Citizen Kane right there at the top. That's not a book, but you know what I mean. But then what happened? So what they did was they sort of said, all right, well, wouldn't it be fun if we did the 100 best books of the 21st century, just books published since the year 2000. And they found 500 and something people from all walks of like literary life. So like writers and professors and researchers and journalists and reviewers to all give their view of the 10 best books of the 21st century. And they invited me to do this.
So cool.
And I thought, what a cool thing. Yes, absolutely. And then I frankly knew my job, which was
your job.
You're making a face.
No, you knew your job, and I will say some of the horror people knew their job, which was
and the horror people knew their job,
right? Which was to say,
and N.K. Jemisin knew her job too.
Yeah, right. Like my job, right? My job is to highlight the best books in the genre I write in, right? Like the books I love that are right, because damn well that the other people are not going to be highlighting horror and romance or genre fiction.
Barbara Kingsolver and Elena Ferrante, were they involved in this? We're not going to put romance on the list. So It fell to me, the lone ranger of romance, out there in the Wild West of New York Times Book Review balloting, to fill that list with books that I really loved from the last 25 years, which was not that difficult for me in any way. So I submitted my list. It was 9 romance novels and Circe by Madeline Miller, which is just a banger. I don't know what to say.
I also think, to me, it was also like a little bit of like reclamation work, if you will. This one's ours, right?
That belongs to me. That belongs to us. Listen, it was really fun and I was very honored to do it, but I knew that in the end, because one of the things that they haven't revealed, but I'm going to reveal because I didn't sign a DNA.
Right.
No,
NDA.
not a DNA.
An NDA. I was like,
it's very hot here. I'm still at the beach. Anyway, so I didn't sign an NDA, and one of the things that they had us do after you submit your ballot, they provided us with this game. And it was like a online game where you click on a link and it takes you to a ballot, like sort of a ranking game where it shows you 2 books and you choose the book you like the best of the 2. And then it was like it was populated with all of our books. Like everybody's books went into this tool and then it would produce 2 books and you had to get it was like, do you prefer Wolf Hall or Random Family, right? And so you had to choose. And so sometimes it was really easy and sometimes it was not so easy. But what started to happen after I had submitted my ballot was every once in a while it'd say, do you prefer like Wolf Hall or Lisa Kleypas's Again the Magic? And Wolf Hall would have a cover and Lisa Kleypas's Again the Magic was just like words. And sometimes, I'll be super honest, sometimes like not even like clear words, like sometimes it was like kind of janky, like over pixelated, weird. So it wasn't the greatest. So I was pretty quickly like, oh no, there's not going to be any romance on this list. So then though, Jen, this week, so then they released the list and sure enough, no romance on the list. And they were very kind and they realized that there was no romance on the list. And they asked me if they could print my ballot, which they did. And so at least my
do that a couple weeks ago. Like, right? I mean,
they knew. I mean, they have to have known like right away. Like, oh, okay, there are some people whose ballots should be printed.
Well, and it's interesting because everybody, let me just pause for a minute. If you have not looked at these lists online, first of all, of course, the New York Times has some paywall, but let me tell you, I will tell you my workaround because I, in a fit of being angry at the New York Times, have canceled my subscription. But on Twitter, like a lot of people shared gift links, right? And so I would like just search like New York Times best 100 books gift and then like just find some random person who's like, here's a gift link. And I was like, great.
Yep.
So,
and there is I retweeted on Threads, everyone, a person who just recreated the list on their own, like made a thread of the 100 books. And I retweeted that. So you guys can go to my Threads and see it there.
This week's episode of Fated Mates is brought to you by Danica Nava, author of The Truth According to Ember.
Okay, so poor Ember. Ember is a Chickasaw woman in Oklahoma City who like has a terrible job working in a bowling alley.
So many balls flying around, Sarah. I can't support it.
And has a dream job working in accounting in the big city where she knows she's going to turn her whole life around and live happily ever after and thrive. Problem is, Ember has applied to 37 jobs.
Terrible.
And every time she applies, she tells the absolute truth about herself and she gets turned down. And she knows what the world is like and decides, like, what if on the 38th I just lie just a tiny bit? And I untick the Native American box on the application and I add a couple more accounting classes and see what happens. Well, what happens is she gets the job and she is thrilled. She thrives in corporate life. Her love life starts to look up. There's a hot IT guy, Danoa Colson, but he's also Native American. And suddenly there are all these things that he and Danica have in common that she's lied about. And then at work, she starts to get caught in all these little white lies and then has to lie in order to keep them all
Oh no.
straight. You know how it goes.
Poor Ember.
So poor Ember. And there's a no dating policy at work. So she and Danoa are also lying about that. And then a scheming colleague blackmails her, threatens to expose their relationship, threatens to expose a lot of other stuff too. And as the manipulation of this colleague grows, Ember has to come to terms with the fact that she has to come clean in order to find happily ever after or lose everything.
Well, this sounds like a real pickle that she is in. And how is she going to get out of it and find true love? I bet she will. So The Truth According to Ember is available right now in print, ebook, and in audio. And make sure you stick around at the end of this week's episode for an audio excerpt of The Truth According to Ember as well. Thanks to Danica Nava for sponsoring this week's episode. So the package of like sort of materials at the New York Times is like two different things. One is the list of their 100 best books. And then they sort of printed the entire ballots for about 25 other people. And that's where your list lives, right?
Right. And it's an interesting group. It's like me and Rebecca Roanhorse and Sarah Jessica Parker and the president of Wesleyan University, like a bunch of sort of like random sort of Stephen King is on there.
Who put his own book on the list, which I guess some people liked. And I was like, come on.
I mean, he's not the only one. Apparently there's a nonfiction woman writer.
The one who wrote the Hemingses of
the
Monticellos or whatever, I think maybe. Yeah. I'm not sure I have that right, but yeah.
So listen, I mean, I long for the day that I have the self-confidence of Stephen King, is what I will say about that. Anyway, but so you can go and see all of those and you can see that like genre writers did the job. Like we all kind of acknowledged that our job was to put horror on the list or thrillers on the list or, Riley Seeger put Gone Girl on the list. Like, and then the Times did a really smart thing or an interesting thing where they said, but wait a second, like, what about readers? And so then Times readers were offered the opportunity to submit their 10 best books. And I thought, this is going to be interesting. Like, is Emily going to be in here? Is like Taylor Jenkins Reid going to be on here? Like who? Colleen? Like what will happen? And the answer is nothing. There are no romance novels on that list either. And this is where I'm going to cede the floor to you because we kind of had a moment, you and I, where we were like, but what about the bops? Like it was so clear on this 100. You guys, you don't even have to look. You know what's on the 100 best books of the century list on the Times. Like everybody went literary.
Let's talk about that in a minute. So there's a couple things. One is I'm going to give credit back to you, Sarah, because you said something really interesting, which is, and I was like, oh yeah, that's the answer. You said, I'm not really super interested in the best books of the 21st century. I am interested in the best reads of the 21st century. We should like sort of like kind of think about what it would look like from the romance pool and then like get a horror podcast. I mean, like,
oh wait, could I also say on that top 100, there was no romance. There was one or two sci-fi and then like basically no horror, basically no thrillers. And surprisingly and unfortunately, no children's or YA.
So anyway, we had been sort of talking about this. And then on our Fated Mates Discord, Kelly, who is one of our listeners, was sort of like tagged me. It was like, Jen, can we get a like Magnificent Firebirds, like sort of best 100 channel? And she has put together an entire, essentially like a spreadsheet where she's like looking for nominations, essentially from anybody in our Discord who wants to, about like what romances should be on there. So like she's just literally was like, hey, what would we say are the best 100 romances of this century so far? And has already like organized a very, and I like, listen, God bless the people who organize, right? Like, God bless the people who are like, hey, like, let's get this started. And I asked Kelly, I was like, hey, do you mind if I say, like, thank you to you for organizing it? And so for those of you who have been, maybe you follow us on Patreon, but you don't really go to the Discord that often, or you've been like wondering like what would the Discord offer you, this might be a really fun time to join. The first round of nominations, I think, goes through August 18th. And then I think there'll be sort of a process of like discussion and winnowing down or whatever. And so our whole Discord has sort of mobilized to really like make this list as well. So it's like, that's totally cool.
I really love this. And I think I peeked in there the other day and I was like, and I was looking at people talking and I love that so many, and I'm not surprised, but I love that so many of our magnificent Firebirds are in there and they are taking it so seriously. Like they really are thinking about like, what are the best romances? And I think one of the things that I'm really excited about is talking about it on like the main podcast, because if you join the Patreon, you also get a separate podcast from us once a month, and it's
Right.
a little more personal and it's a little more like inside baseball. But talking about it here, one of the things that Eric always reminds us is like, if something really fun is happening on the Discord, you don't have to join forever. You can just join for the month, participate in this thing, and then peace out. And we still love you, and that's fine. But this is just a really fun thing that's happening over there. And if you're interested, you should head over and join the Patreon. You can do that at fatedmates.net/Patreon. There's also, a link in show notes right now. By the way, our show notes look different now. Everything's much more fancy.
Oh yeah, we're using a new service, everybody, to host the podcast.
We hit 300 episodes.
I know, it's
because you all are still here. Just a shocking reality for us.
I know.
Anyway, so what do you want to talk about?
Like, okay, so like looking at like the 100 best books list that the New York Times has, like what as sort of like a model, right? Like what's like the perils and promise of even making a list like this? And like my whole thing is like, look, any list like this is just a list. Of course, it's not actually ever going to be the 100 best books. Like it's not, canon making. We're not in charge of anything. I think the reason to have lists like this is just like purely for like the discussion, right? To like sort of fight and to like sort of have to like have those big talks about like, well, what would you put on the list and why? And, like what would the rules be for making this list? So like, for example, I think there's two things about the New York Times list that I found particularly notable. One that I think is positive and one that I think is actually negative. So for me,
everybody, we have not had this conversation.
Yeah, no, because you've been in, Sarah's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. The thing I think is really positive and pretty cool is that the list is not just fiction. So the list is fiction and nonfiction. And so, for example, if we were going to make a top 100 best books of the 21st century, it is without a doubt that we would put the Black Love Matters, like, right, if you're going to do the romance one, right? Like, here is an example of, we don't really usually talk that much about like nonfiction about the romance genre. Because it has like, there's some weird buckets that it falls in, right? Like, so you get like the how to write books, right? And you get, so like sort of like romancing the beat if you have never, like the craft books, essentially, for lack of a better word. But there aren't truly that often like books of nonfiction about the romance world that would like sort of land on a list like this. But here's an example of one that I think could. Or for example, there's that like Love in the Time of Self-Publishing book, which has just come out, which is like an academic book, like published by Princeton, that's about sort of like what happened when romance like moved to self-publishing. So like one of the cool things I think about the New York Times list is like making some space for us to really think like, okay, hey, if we were going to think about this in romance, like what would those books be? Right. And maybe Romancing the Beat would go on there. Maybe, what is like that Gail Carriger book, like The Heroine's Journey. Right. And so I think so I was really inspired to think like, oh, hey, wait, that's kind of cool.
What is our version of those books?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say also just to piggyback on that, looking at the full, obviously, when I was making my ballot, I was very much focused on the job right? But I think a lot of people were really thoughtful. A lot of the people who filled out the ballot were really thoughtful about nonfiction. And I think on top of the nonfiction thing, they were really thoughtful in general. There were a lot of books that ended up on the best list that I have read in the past, and that like I definitely have not thought of in 15 years. Like I mentioned Random Family, which is nonfiction and is like it is about kind of the crisis of the working poor. It's a biography of the working poor in America, I think they're in New York City, in the Bronx. But and like I read it when it came out in 2004, and it was groundbreaking then and amazing then. But like if you asked me a week ago to name a great piece of nonfiction, it would not have been on my list, even though the moment I saw it, I was like, oh, of course. Like I think one of the things that has come up for me while I've been thinking about the list in general and why I'm so excited about it, Firebirds putting together this list is this idea that like, if we all are in this mix, it is going to produce books that we don't think about all the time.
Okay, so to like return to like my one positive, one negative, or whatever, right? So here's what I think of as being like to me the big negative of this list is.
Oh, I know what you're gonna say. Now I do know what you're saying.
I think it should be one book per author. Mm-hmm. Unless potentially, I guess you could make the argument of like, in this case, like one nonfiction book or one fiction book, or like maybe if we were going to do it, maybe like, in different subgenres. But like, I just personally am like, look, if you're going to put 100 books on there, do 4 of them need to be by like Elena Ferrante or who's that Canadian?
Alice Munro.
Or Alice Munro, right? Like, I don't think so, because you definitely are leaving other authors who arguably have written great books off the table, right? And I think, correct. But I think that is that belief or that like sort of idea is very much rooted for me in the belief that it's not a real list, right? The whole point is arguing. And so if you're going to put on one Elena Ferrante book, then everybody gets to have like a fun argument about whether or not you picked the right one. Right? As opposed to we're going to put 4 on there. Like
Ben just likes to tussle.
I do like to tussle, right? And so I think that is, tricky, of course, but like then I think a lot about like there have been all about romance at some point back when I first got into Romancelandia. And so this probably would have been, I don't know, 2017, 2018, whatever, had like a best 100 romances of all time.
I think they still do it.
Yeah, maybe they do. I'm not sure. That was like the first time.
It's always Lord of Scoundrels right up there to the top.
I think it was Devil in Winter, maybe, or Devil in Spring. But there were like 9 books by Lisa Kleypas. And look, I love Lisa Kleypas. But I just do not believe that like 9
of 100 books.
Of 100 books, 9 books should be by any one author. Like that is just saying, I think, something about how limited your reading really is, right?
Right.
And I think, and so that to me would be like a real, I would say, I just don't think there needs to be. I really don't. I don't think there needs to be 100. I don't think there needs to be more than one book by any one author. Pick their best one. Fight.
Yeah. I mean, my issue with it, here's my issue, and I think it does translate also, it translate into any genre, right? If any genre were making this list, and I don't really know about other genres, so I can't speak to it for other genres, but I can say that like, there are a number, Lord of Scoundrels would not be eligible for this list, right? So it's a good example, right? Because I think that empirically, many of us feel like Lord of Scoundrels is a perfect example, is like a tremendous book that if we were talking about the genre to anybody outside of the genre, we would say like, this is a gold standard of romance, right? And I think for many of us, like, we just believe that it's one of the best. And so if we were asked, like, what's the best romance novel of all time, we might just say Lord of Scoundrels because it's Citizen Kane, right? Like, it just is. And maybe I do believe that. I'm not actually sure if I do believe that. I would have to really think about it. But anyway, it's not eligible, so I don't ever have to discuss this. It's like, but my point is that I think that with this list, it felt like a lot of people went, and I was listening to the book review podcast this week about it in preparation for this conversation. And they all kind of, it was like the four of the editors of the book review in the podcast. And they were all kind of like, yeah, people went fancy. Like, people said like, oh, Franzen is on this list, or like, I can't, I mean, I don't know. But if you look at the list, it's sort of like they did. They sort of sat down and they said, well, what is the literature of the last 25 years? Instead of being like, what are the bops? And I think that's, for me, there were some books on there that I think are so fun. Like, I think Cavalier and Clay is really great. I think like, I think there are some I think Elena Ferrante is really a fun read. But I think that for the most part, people were like, what are the like highbrow literati important books of the last 25 years? And that's a valuable question, but it's not the question that I, as a reader, am interested in. Like, what I'm interested in is top of my TBR. What are the books that I'm not going to want to put down? And in the podcast, the New York Times podcast, and I'll put a link to this in show notes too, that podcast, they talk, I think it's Tina Jordan, who is, came from Entertainment Weekly, interestingly, right? So like has an interesting pedigree. She was saying like she put Gone Girl on her list, like, because for her, and then she said like Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld wasn't on there, and she thought that it would be. Like, there are these books that transformed culture in a lot of ways, and like really made cultural like zeitgeist moments happen, and none of them got on that list. So my question is, if you translate this to romance, like, is there like, what happens? Like, does Colleen Hoover get on this list, right? Like, are Emily Henry books on this list? Is, the Love Hypothesis on this list? Like, what does best mean? This week's episode of Fated Mates is sponsored by Lumi Gummies, free THC gummies delivered legally nationwide. Lumi Gummies has a whole rainbow of flavors and feelings and offers sativa, hybrid, and indica effects, so you can choose the kind of vibe you're looking for.
So I really love these gummies, and had a friend over last week, and we'd had sort of a long day. We'd done a lot of walking. We also like sort of hunched over the puzzle table a little too hard. Mm-hmm. That's where I am in life. And we took some gummies at night, and it was just like relaxed us, like sort of like took the edge off that feeling of being a little tensed and stressed. And, having been in the sun for maybe too long that day. And so this is like a great way to sort of just like take the edge off, make that feeling of like sort of enjoying the end of your day, maybe like sitting on the couch and watching a funny movie, all that more pleasant and fun. So I definitely would recommend that anyone check out these gummies. They are terrific.
I use Lumi Gummies to mitigate my anxiety and just like turn it down a notch. My favorite thing about them is that for me, I don't actually feel high at all. I just feel like a touch calmer, which is best for everyone in my orbit, I think, sometimes. Anyway, you can go to lumigummies.com and use code FATED50 for free gummies with a limited time $50 off coupon if you want to just try them. If you're listening to this in September, it's too late, but you can always year-round use the code FATEDMATES for 30% off your order. But right now, for a limited time, you can go to lumigummies.com and use the code FATED50 at checkout for a free jar of gummies. Again, that's lumigummies.com, and the code is FATED50.
Thanks, as always, to Lumi Labs for sponsoring this week's episode. do you want to talk a little bit more about like the 9 romances you put on the list? And like,
Yes.
because my memory of that is that like some of them you were like, these are empirically the best, and some of them are just my favorite. And I think that a good list should kind of like hit in both of those ways, right? So why don't we talk about your list for a minute?
Yes.
And kind of, because I think that's, those are the only romances on there. So like, let's hear what happened.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there was a little bit of that for me. I was like, certainly when I sat with the ballot to begin with, I thought to myself, all right, well, who are the other people who may have been asked? Right?
Okay, sure.
Because I knew, for example, like probably Olivia Waite.
Sure. I would imagine, right. Of course.
Was asked because she is the New York Times
romance columnist,
romance critic. I was like, probably Carol Bell was asked, right? Carol writes for the Times. Jamie Green, who used to review for the Times, maybe. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, Tina used to work with Maureen Lenker. Like, there was a little bit of me thinking like
kind of gaming it out, right?
A little bit gaming it in the sense that I was like, well, if I pick a book that I know both I and Olivia loved, that might be more likely to get on the list.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. So for me, I was a little bit trying to game the system because I knew there was no way these books were getting on the list. Mm-hmm. Right. So like if you're making a Hail Mary pass, you like try really hard to throw it to the right person, and just hope that they're there to catch it. So but then it was very easy for me to like think up, like I knew that I feel like I could have guessed in some ways, like some of the books. So then I sort of set that aside and then I made my list, right? And this is not the full list. Obviously, I made a list that was like 30 books long. And then it was about winnowing it down. So like for me, Lisa Kleypas's Again, the Magic is on here. I love this book. I think this is I think it's Lisa's quietest book, or one of Lisa's quieter books. It's all internal conflict. Also, for me, I was like, what are the books that a Times reader would potentially want to read?
Yeah.
Right? So for me, and also everybody was like, it wasn't Derek Craven. Well, of course it wasn't. Derek Craven was published in the early 90s, right? So that was also a limitation. Like there were a lot of books that I was like, oh, I'll put that on. And then I went looking and realized like, oh no, that was published in 1990, whatever, right? So obviously there was going to be a Cressley on this list because for me, she is a cornerstone text of the 21st century romance. I picked Dark Needs at Night's Edge because I think it, again, is the most approachable. It is one of the most approachable of the IAD books. I also do believe that it's one of the best of the IAD books. And then somebody asked me online, like, why not Sweet Ruin? And I was like, because it feels to me like Dark Needs at Night's Edge, like, is a better, in some ways, is a better romance if you're making this list, right? Like, I don't know. These are hard questions. Like some of it was just sort of like vibe. Nobody will be surprised that I put Milla Vane's A Heart of Blood and Ashes on here. Like for me, first of all, Jen was like,
Men in Fur, represent.
For me, A Heart of Blood and Ashes is, I mean, I do believe that it is like, it might be one of my five. We have talked about doing an episode where it's like our 5 favorites of all time. And I think it would be very hard for me to not put that on that. I wanted the list to reflect the sort of breadth of romance too, which is why it was important to me that there be historicals and contemporaries and paranormals. I was really happy that Bet Me. I did not think Bet Me was published in the 2000s. And then when I saw that, I went back to the Fate of Mates list and I looked at that whole list. So that's why Jenny Cruzy's Bet Me is on there. Also because I think it's a banger. everybody knows my big feelings about Angelina M. Lopez's After Hours on Milagro Street. I think it's a perfect example of how modern romance can get. It's really telling a different kind of story. Bev is on here because she's Bev, like for the same reason Lisa is. Like there was no question for me. Bev has been writing longer than 25 years. Is Forbidden my favorite Bev book? No. But do I believe it might be her best book of the 20th century? Yes. Or 21st century? Yes. So Kate is on here because I think Kate is she is a writer who I put Georgie All Along on because I think Georgie All Along really represents like what contemporary romance is right now, how beautiful it can be, how it edges up on other forms of novels and other forms of fiction. Kate writes a beautiful sentence. It's a beautiful book. You know, Ravishing the Heiress is on there because it's great.
Yeah.
Like some of these are just great.
Great book. Right, exactly.
And I think Hana Khan, I put Uzma Jalaluddin's Hana Khan Carries On there too, for the same reason that I put Angelina on there. Like there is something so contemporary about.
You feel like you can see the future of the genre when you read those books.
Yeah.
Right?
So for me, it was about finding the things that were in the past that were great, finding the things that speak to the future and the like growth of the genre and where we are and the hopeful sort of progression of genre here, and also building out a list that spoke to all the different corners of the genre. And obviously there are things that are missing. But I felt really good about this list. This is a list of books that if anybody said, like Sarah McLean said, these are the books, I would be like, I do.
Yeah. These are the books.
I stand by it.
Yeah.
These are the books. If you read these 9 books and Circe by Madeline Miller, which did not even make the Song of Achilles made the reader list, but not Circe.
The reader list. It's not on the
reader. Yeah. It's not on the 100 best.
It's not on the 100 best, yeah.
Which made me mad, but whatever. I think if you read these 9 books, you would understand why I love romance.
Like I will admit to everyone, because I think a lot of people are like, well, what's on your list? I didn't get asked. And so I have not been in that terrible position of having to choose 10 books. Like, right. I love myself. But I think that it's been really interesting to be thinking about it. I think one of the things I just want to like sort of pull out, like sort of tease out a little bit is when you're approaching like making a list like this for yourself or for like others or whatever, right? Keeping central the idea that like, if you read these books, you'd know why I love romance, right? Like this is not a list that's like outward facing or like, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's what you were.
I think that's part of it too. I should say. I had no knowledge that this was going to be made public.
Yeah, until they asked you later, right?
They asked me later if they could make it public.
Right.
And I said yes.
Yeah. So it wasn't like right. And I think that that's like really important. Like when you're list making, you really, I mean, and I think that's where the 100 books list feels a little performative, right? Some of these books are books people kind of feel are important, but maybe don't like love, and others do, right? I mean, I've read 40 of the books on the 100 list, and there are some great books in there, like books I truly loved and people have probably heard me talking about, right? I mean, so it was like you, I had sort of books I'd like, oh, I'd forgotten I love that book so much or whatever. Yeah. But, you know, so I mean, I think it is the great thing about crowdsourcing a list like this, or like what's going to happen on the Discord is you're right. Like that sense of like, oh, I'd forgotten I love that book so much. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But I think so like for me, but the other thing I really liked that you said was sometimes you're picking a text because it really speaks to like a time or right. And then other times you're like, okay, I have to pick a book by Lisa Kleypas, but which one am I going to pick? Right. Like so sometimes I think the act of list making is you're saying like this name has such a huge outsized influence on the genre as a whole that of course a book by that author will end up on the list.
Yeah.
Right. Versus
that's what I was saying about
Bev and
you know, Colleen and
Yeah.
and,
Right.
Emily. And it's interesting because I thought about those.
Yeah.
And I was like, but for me, I mean, there was also, I'll be totally honest, there was a real piece of this for me that wanted it to be about the romance genre before it became cool to read romance. Is that snarky? That might be a little snarky. But like, it just felt to me like what I wanted this list to represent was like truly like when we think of ourselves as romance readers for a lifetime, for 25 years.
Yeah.
So many of the books that we read and loved over the last 25 years were not books that like would ever even touch the Times list. And here we are, right? Proof.
Right.
And so I deliberately steered clear of books that I thought, you know, might end up on there from someone who wasn't a romance reader.
Yeah. Right. And I think the part about that that's then really interesting is, but that's also like the work of saying of the past 25 years, right? Like, so I'm sure everybody, one of my, like a term I really like is recency bias, right? Like our bias
which was
is
hard with
yeah,
this.
of course.
Yeah.
Our bias towards things that is more recent. And that's why like I'll always be grateful that we at least at some point, you know, we're going to have like our best of lists for, you know, however many years, because it is that snapshot of like, wait, what was I loving then? But I think also in romance in particular, this is a really interesting conversation because of the whole idea of like the keeper shelf. Yep. Right? Like, and this, everybody, you know this is it's like, these are the books that like you've read and they just like have a place in your heart and there they stay forever. And the weird thing about the keeper shelf is the books you think that will be on there sometimes aren't, right? Like you have to constantly be reevaluating it, right? So in some ways, this whole action is like a sort of saying like, okay, collectively, what would be on our keeper shelf as being like these best reads? I think though, the other thing I was thinking a lot about is the other reason why it's great to do this by committee. And like that committee should be as like broadly, widely interesting as like, you know, dynamic and diverse a group of readers as possible in the truest sense of the word, is because of like our blind spots, right? Like if you and I made this list alone, there obviously would be a real like lack of, you know, there wouldn't be a lot of romantic suspense because we just don't read as much of it. There wouldn't be as much dark romance because we don't read as much of it. There wouldn't be as much, right? So one of the reasons to like, especially with romance, is like get as many people in the list making as possible is because of that.
This week's episode of Fated Maids is sponsored by Stephanie Rose, author of Second Time's the Charm.
So Jesse has gone from uncle to father overnight. He's had to move back. Yeah, it's really starting this book with like a real tragic beginning. And he has to go back to his hometown after being away for 2 decades. And he's trying to like pick up the pieces, feel his feelings, and do right by this little girl who just misses her mom. So it's, you know, his 20th high school reunion, and he gets out for the night and he comes face to face with Emily, who's the girl he dated in high school, who he broke her heart. And he basically, I mean, at the time was like just a dumb kid, right? Thought I better break her heart before she breaks mine. But he can't really do anything about those feelings right now. He just is overwhelmed. So he just offers her an apology, says they can be friends, and that's really all he's capable of. Except it turns out that Emily is his niece's soccer coach. And all of a sudden he's on the sidelines spending quite a lot of time in her presence and starts thinking, hey, maybe there is a chance for us. So everything changes one night. They kind of tell each other their real feelings, and he decides to start fighting for Emily, right? Thinking he's wasted too much time without her in his arms. And so this is a big second times the charm chance for them to find love.
I love it when a man gets it together.
Me too.
This one is perfect for anybody who loves a second chance romance, obviously. Set in a small town, single dads, a big golden retriever hero who falls first. And you can get it in print, ebook, and with your monthly subscription to Kindle Unlimited. And thanks, as always, to Stephanie Rose for sponsoring this week's episode. Well, and it's interesting, right? Because you and I had talked sort of right after the list came out about this kind of like, what are the best reads, not the best books.
Right.
And because honestly, and I want to say, largely because like you said, I'm not interested in the best books as a reader.
Right.
I went to school already. So,
yes, right.
I want reading to be like full. I want it to be balls to the wall for me, right? But what I think is really interesting is we had originally talked about, well, wouldn't it be fun if we got all these other people together? Like if we got a group of 500 genre writers.
Yeah, right.
And here's the thing. The more I think about it, the more I think romance would still get screwed.
Mm.
And the reason why is because romance readers, a million years ago, Jen Northington, who at the time worked for Word bookstores, but now works for Book Riot, said to me, the fascinating thing about romance readers and what independent booksellers need to understand is that romance readers read in addition to other books, but other readers do not read romance. So what would happen is we would have our 500 people, and if it was like 100 from each genre, right, the other books would get votes from romance.
Sure.
But romance would not get votes from the others largely. I mean, obviously, this
interesting. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because like thriller writers, experts in thriller aren't out here going like, oh, yeah, I read that again, the Magic book.
Right. Whereas like, I would totally be like
I've read Gone Girl.
Right. Or like a really big thriller last year was a book called All This by S.A. Cosby, All the Sinners Bleed, I think. And I was like, I'm going to read that. It was great. Right.
Yeah.
So that's it. Like I said, I've read 40 of the books on the New York Times list. And if you'd asked me before it came out, I'd have been like 3. I bet I've read 3.
Yeah.
Well, no,
and I think that the only other genre, and I've said this a million times on the podcast, but I think the only other genre that even comes close to where we would sit in that pool is YA and children's, right? But now I think, but I do still think that more adult readers read YA, for example, or like more people outside of YA read YA than outside of romance read romance.
Yeah, that's probably true. So
with the exception of, Emily.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, right. Well, and that's it. It's like a true crossover. A true crossover author is a real unicorn.
But it's interesting, right? Because I think about, like, for example, Christina Lauren, right? Who I know loves a thriller. Loves a thriller. So, like, I would be fascinated by Christina's list. Like, what are the 10 best reads of the last 25 years for you? And I would think she probably has a real balance.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because but like I said, though, one of the things I was like personally just really fascinated by was, and I think I noticed it. I want to like everybody made the list they had to make, right? But I think I really clued into it with Scott Turow, who wrote Presumed Innocent, which is a real banger of a thriller from back in the day. And his list was essentially like 4 Elena Ferrante books and like not a single thriller. And I was kind of like, well,
what are you doing, Scott?
It was fascinating to me, right? Because I thought, what's happening there? You know what I mean?
And that's what would happen if Bev, for example, were asked. Beverly Jenkins does not read romance.
She's a huge sci-fi and fantasy reader, right?
Very, very public about the fact that she doesn't read
right.
romance. She reads sci-fi and fantasy, and that's her thing, and that's what she loves.
Right.
So, like, sure, it's great, but also I do think like when you're asked to do this, Scott.
Yeah. It's like
knowing that thrillers don't make this list the way that other things do.
I think that's what it was interesting to me is like you're now essentially repping for your colleagues who other people are going to bring their whole like, well, I better talk about how much I loved, My Brilliant Friend or Wolf Hall. And look, I also love My Brilliant Friend and Wolf Hall. It's a great book. But a million people are going to say Wolf Hall, but people were not going to say, well, here's the best Jack Reacher book. Right? Like,
yeah. What about Lee? I wonder if they asked Lee.
well, and that was
Listen to me
the
talking
one
about Lee Child like I know him.
Lee.
What about Lee?
What about Lee? No. Well, I think one of the things that was then really interesting. So and again, like, who knows, right?
So
like,
apparently they did ask a number of people who did not.
Who said, no, you can't make my ballot
Who said, no,
public.
you can't make my ballot public. And of course, now I'm like,
Sure.
I mean, we can guess all the reasons why that would be the case.
Yeah.
But
it was in that way, I think, very smart of them to get people to do it first
and then
ask. Because then you really were.
Well, it's honesty, right?
Right. Then you're really thinking like, okay, what? Yeah. So, I mean, I was like, really fascinated by it.
How many people filled out a ballot and just put a bunch of their own books on there? Lee Child, Reacher 1, Reacher 2.
Bad Luck and Trouble. Right? Yeah. I mean, so I just thought the whole, so I guess I will say this, like, even more so than the result, I was very interested in this process. I want to say I just want to flag like one other thing I really noticed, and I haven't been back to look at these comments, but on the comments for I don't know. So there was the 100 books from the New York Times, and then I guess the author choices, right? Like those sort of ballots from people like you. On that, there were comments, and one of them was Sarah Jessica Parker's books, and I was like, if you think misogyny is
the way
dead,
people came for that poor woman,
for her. And I was super outraged by it. I was kind of like,
Sarah Jessica Parker allowed to vote?
Yes. How dare she be a reader? Now, I think one of the things I immediately thought was, well, I wonder if it was just a famous actor who loved reading, if they would have come up. And I was like, haha, I think I know the answer to that. But I had sort of said something about it on Twitter, and someone pointed out that she is actually a person who has put her fame, her money, her everything behind essentially fighting the cuts to the New York Public Library system. So this is a woman who is...
I didn't know that.
I did not either. So not only is this woman not only is she a huge reader, but here's a person who has put a lot of like herself into a fight to save the library system of the biggest city in our country. And yet the way people talked about her in those comments was disgusting.
Yeah.
Right? It was super gross. And so it was really interesting for me too, to sort of think like, I was also just really fascinated by who gets to have the right to a favorite, right?
Yep. And can I just say another thing that I was like really pleasantly surprised by was how diverse the list was.
Oh yeah.
With the notable exception of Indigenous writers, who apparently I didn't realize this until a couple of days ago when I saw somebody say it, but like there are no Indigenous writers on this list. And I think so that's an issue. But I think a lot about, I think we've maybe talked about this a million years ago on the podcast, but Rolling Stone every year does an issue of their 100 best albums of forever. And for many, many, many years, it was just like Jan Wenner and his cronies writing and doing this list. And it like the best albums were like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and like, just like a sea of white bands.
Right.
And white men. And then a couple of years ago, they put together a new group, and it was like a much larger group, first of all, but also included like artists and critics who were women and people of color and queer people, and like just a very, very diverse group of judges and voters, including like people like Beyonce, like all different, a full walk of life kind of list. And all of a sudden, like everything shifted.
Of course.
And like the best album was, I think, James Brown. And it suddenly was like, oh, now we're starting to see it. I will say I was shocked that it was Elena Ferrante, number one.
Well,
Shocked. But also, I think that game, if we played that game, or a bunch of people played that game, like,
right, maybe
I could see how that would happen.
Well, but this is like an example. Like, one of my all-time favorite literary fiction authors is Louise Erdrich, who is Native. And I was like, why 4 books by Elena Ferrante or Alice Munro, but no books by Louise Erdrich, for example, right? And I'm a little like, so it's really interesting. A book that kind of came up a lot in the ballots section, right? Which what you did was a book called The Only Good Indians, which is like, apparently, I think it's horror though. And I am such a chicken. So it was like, but it was interesting. I think that was, to me, the other thing that was really interesting was, okay, so here's the 100 books, right? But then in that list from the ballots, like, what were the books that kind of appeared over and over again that didn't appear on that list? And that was one that appeared a couple of times. And that was why I think I sort of clued in, like, oh, I think the horror writers or the horror adjacent people kind of understood the job, which was like, hey, horror is probably not going to be well represented on this list, or it's going to be like literary horror. It's going to be The Road, which it was, right? And and so we're going to instead put, I will put some horror books on here, and then people like me can be like, okay, hey, what are these books, right?
Yeah, I gotta say, if you're looking for just like, for me, it felt, and not just because my ballot is in that group, but like the publication of the ballots, I went through and I did the same thing where I looked at I went to writers who I know and love and respect if their ballot was published, and I looked at the books that they chose that made the list,
right,
that I haven't read.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll read that. Right.
Right.
And then, like I said, if you are looking for, like Jen said, if you're looking for a very particular kind of book, there is definitely a writer in the mix who is like that. I mean, I will say Rebecca Roanhorse is a good example of somebody who also knew the job. Yeah. Like, she went in, she filled her ballot exactly the way she should have filled her ballot. We came from the same school of thought.
Yes, right.
we were name checked together on the New York Times podcast as like McLean and Roanhorse, just like,
right.
Like vibing in the corner.
Yeah. I would say the only person who seemed to come close to me was Jason Reynolds, who did put 2 YA books on, right? And I think,
as he should have.
Right, exactly. So, and then like, books, I mean, obviously that were like, some big bangers, but it was really interesting. I mean, so I was just really, again, like I said, the process of the way this played out was far more interesting to me and gave me something to sort of like sink my teeth into that was not just,
Well, like, it's so fascinating. Now I'm looking at this list again, and now everybody, please go to this list for I mean, like, I hope you pull this up at the beginning of this episode.
Yeah, right. Well, we'll put a link in show notes of maybe the one that Sarah said, where it's a thread, where that way if you don't have a New York Times
and then
subscription,
can I just gift link this other one? How many people can click on a gift link? Not that many.
I don't know. Like, again, you could also do what I did. I think you can click on them. Squarespace has sometimes like rejects big long links like that, and so we'll see.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see what we can do, but we'll definitely put the links in, and I think it's really worth just wandering through here. I also was noticing, I was very curious about which of these lists did not have any books on the 100 list, because when you scroll through here, it says at the bottom of everything, like 6 of these choices made the 100 list, which feels like a grading system. But also, like, for the dirtbag smoker in the back of the room, like me, I was like, who's in the back of the room with me? And like Ellen Hildebrand, none of her books made the list. Like, so then I went through and I actually flagged all those lists too, because I was like, oh, maybe these are the bops.
It was funny because I noticed Ellen Hillenbrand's list was, to me, also like kind of less women's
Yeah, weird,
fiction-y.
right?
I was like, this is
not weird like the books are bad, but weird like not really Ellen Hildebrand books. Like
Yeah.
she had Erin Morgenstern's The Night Circus on there,
Yeah.
which is another book that like that's a book that was so huge.
popular. Oh God, yeah.
And
right.
everybody read that book, and I was surprised. Once I saw it on her list, I thought, oh, why didn't that make everybody's, why wasn't that on there? I think it's just really, this whole episode has been banter. And I apologize if you were expecting, something
Very
else.
targeted banter. I think it's fine.
Targeted banter, right? But very,
yeah,
of a time. But I think, yeah, tell us what you think about these lists. Like, what are you gonna read? What looks like it's something that you would try? Have you read all the books on my list?
Yeah.
And then, like we said, head over to the Patreon for the month if you want to be a part of making a romance list. And then maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll send it to the Times.
I think we
see
should.
what they say.
It's funny because I guess in the process of
have
this,
you read Pachinko?
Oh God, I love that book.
Do you people say I have not read that book, and everybody says it's so fun.
It is a great read, Sarah.
Okay.
It
All
really
right,
is.
I'm getting it.
Yeah. And you know what? One of the reasons I recommended it to my mom, who is like reads like it's a sweeping family drama epic that takes place over like the course of the Korean War, and it's, oh my gosh, it's so good.
Okay.
It is a great read. It really is. Yeah, Pachinko's a great book. The other books, it was really funny. Like the other books, it's like if you were kind of like, wait, you've read 40 or whatever, what would I recommend? Or what, because if you basically if you go to this, even if you're not a subscriber, if you can get on there, underneath every book there's a little like checks box, like I've read this book or I want to read it, right? And it makes you a nice little graphic, so you can be like, wait, what books have I read? Pachinko's great. The book I was really like, oh, I didn't realize this book was as well regarded. I love the book Never Let Me Go.
Oh, it's so good.
It's so good.
It's so good.
And I was like, oh, I just thought that was like a weird, not that is obviously a big author,
like a weird
right? Exactly. It's not like a weird little nobody, but it felt like a book that people at the time, at least when it came out, was kind of like, oh, he wrote this weird book,
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say Life After Life is a banger. Like that is a legitimately great read.
Yeah. Now I feel like we should just do this. Let's just scroll these lists and tell people what they should read.
Okay, let's start. Yeah.
You want to start at the top with Stephen King?
Wait, are we looking at the ballot lists or the?
No,
100?
I'm looking at these other people
at the ballot.
But yeah, we don't have. I mean,
no, it's fine. Yeah, let's look at these. Okay. Wait, one more book off of the top 100 list. That's like I've talked about the book Say Nothing a million times, how much I love that book, set in Northern Ireland.
Set in Northern, that's a great book too.
Yeah, it's a great book. And then there's
that book, fun fact, is one of the inspirations for my next contemporary. I mean, not inspiration. It's not like I'm going to write a book set in Northern Ireland, but
there's a really weird, another book out. I was like, oh, this made it on here. If you love music at all, there's a book on there called Pulphead by John Jeremiah Sullivan. It's a book of essays.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a man who wrote, and I'm sure I've talked about it, that profile of Axl Rose. And it is
all right.
It is it's a great book too. If you are like, I like music, or I like sort of criticism about like music, and like it's also really terrific. It's so good, in fact, that it was like one of those books where I'm like, oh, look at this book on the best of 100 list. It's awesome. Okay. So yeah, let's look at some of the other books that we would recommend.
We have to, this is getting long, but I think we should do this. This is fun. Okay. You guys, now we're just going to go through book lists and talk about books. So here we are.
Yeah.
Eric's going to be like, oh my God, so many chapters.
It really won't be. It'll be fine.
It won't. So, okay, Stephen King, listen, as far as I'm concerned, you can skip Atonement. I know that's
I
I'm
never
I'm
read. I did
choosing
this.
violence.
I DNF'd.
But like skip it.
Bored.
I was number 26 on the main list, and
Yeah.
honestly, just it's fine.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and throw a bomb and say, go ahead and skip The Goldfinch, which is another book I also did not like.
I was so surprised that it made the list.
Yeah.
Goldfinch is one of those books that, like, over time, people have said, like, oh, I read it, and like I never understood it. But, like, apparently, you know, it made number 46 on the list.
Sure.
Gone Girl is great. You should
Yeah,
listen
it
to it
is.
in audio. It's terrific in audio.
Sarah Waters' book is good. Sarah Waters writes a great book. Yeah, the
And then
Paindex.
that Viet the Viet Win Sympathizer book is terrific. That is a really, really great book. Interestingly, he put Margaret Atwood on here, and I think that's another example of like, I'm going to put a Lisa Kleypas book on here, but which one? Because like Atwood is so prolific, but like, what are my favorite Atwood books? They are not in the last 25 years. So many people put. I'm just scrolling now. So Min Jin Lee, who wrote Pachinko,
Right.
this list looks really honest. I think she really was like, these are the books I loved the most. But what I will say is that a lot of people put All the Light We Cannot See, Anthony Doerr's book, on, and so many people on these lists, on these ballots, that I'm curious as to how it's possible that they didn't get on. It didn't get the final list.
Yeah.
This Barbara Ehrenreich, Nickel and Dimed, is
amazing. It's a great
read.
A
really terrific book about about, again, like just how hard it is to be alive in America. Yeah. And
right. The Phil Clay book, Redeployment, is on her list as well. And if you are at all interested in reading like the fiction of war, it is terrific. Phil Clay writes a great book about this is, I believe, about Afghanistan, Iraq. I can't remember which one, but I read that book and really, really liked it. I like a book about war, though, so surprising no one. Everyone loves that book, Educated by Tara Westover. I will admit I've never read it. Bum, bum.
Well,
sorry, everybody. Okay.
Wait, what book are you talking about?
Educated by Tara Westover.
Oh, yeah, I haven't read that.
But people say it's great, but you all know that already because you've all already read it.
There's Never Let Me Go on Carl Nausgaard's book. This is a good example of like, he writes so funny and none of these books are funny.
Yeah, I've never read one of his books, but I will say that Chernobyl book, Voices from Chernobyl, which is a book of, it's literally just like interviews with people, right? So it's like a, oh my God, Sarah, I'm like spacing out what it's called. Anyway, it is great. Of course, I've read it because it's about Chernobyl. And There's Never Let Me Go.
There's Never Let Me Go. Again, yes, correct. Which is why it was number 9. Ta-Nehisi Coates is Between the World and Me.
Oh, we're talking about Bonnie Garmis's list. Yeah.
It's terrific.
It's terrific.
She put Harry Potter on, which I thought people would put Harry Potter on. She also put A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius on. And Bonnie, have you really finished that book? Because I have questions. So,
yeah, Demon Copperhead is what my book club is reading this month, so I'll report back on that one.
People love that one.
Yeah.
That was number 1 in the reader list.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting because I really like Barbara Kingsolver, but Curtis Sittenfeld. I have not read any of these books. The Line of Beauty, though, is one that appeared on so many lists that it's like, I think really has risen to the top of mine. R.L. Stine, again, I think sort of, right, like got Gone Girl on there. Don Winslow writes kind of thrillers, so that's probably what that is. I like James McBride, but have not read Deacon King Kong. Devil in the White City, of course, is a Chicago classic.
Right. Which I actually just read a couple of weeks ago.
Really?
Yeah. Weird. Like,
so funny.
I found it was in my little free library.
And you're like
one of those books that I've always been like, I want to read that. And then, but I had a great time.
As you would. People love this book, The Thursday Murder Club. If you're like mysteries, it's in third person, so I'm afraid to report I tried and abandoned it.
There's Jonathan Safran Foer, another person who I always feel like people just put on lists because they don't understand. The Ulysses of our time.
Right.
And I'm saying that to somebody who has a Ulysses tattoo. So
Exactly. Okay. Oh my God, I'm gonna save something for that for banter. Okay, this is taking a long time. So let's see. We're gonna like
no,
maybe
I know.
do some
Let's just zoom
skinning.
through here.
What else is like sticking out as being like good
Oh,
and interesting?
Americana.
I did love that book.
Oh, Americana is a great book. Number 27 on the main
I
list.
love that book.
Let's see. Sarah Jessica Parker's list has Franzen on it and Say Nothing.
Wait, yeah, this book Wave, I've mentioned before as being the saddest book ever written.
Yes.
It is a memoir about a woman whose entire family, and I mean her parents, her husband, and her children all died during the tsunami in 2004. If you are just like, I
read the first, after you talked about it on the podcast once, I like downloaded it and I read the first chapter and it was too much.
Devastating, but it is an amazing read. Yeah.
Wolf Hall is a book that you and I both love.
I love that book. Yeah. Wolf Hall is
and that's Anthony Doerr's list. Anthony Doerr wrote All the Light We Cannot See, which won the Pulitzer. Another reason why it's surprising it didn't make the list.
Yeah.
James Patterson. See, James Patterson did it. This is sort of cool. Like Dennis Lehane's on here, Steve Larson. Like, what about those Girl with the Dragon Tattoo books?
Yeah, God, right? People ate
I'm
those
so surprised
up, right?
They didn't get on there. Kitchen Confidential is a great book.
Yeah. The Book Thief is an amazing YA book.
Interestingly, this is making me think there aren't that many biographies on the main list.
Oh, yeah, there aren't. Right, sure.
Like this Keith Richards book was great.
Yeah, I haven't read
Life.
I have read for Stephen Graham. Are we moving on? Are you still on?
No, I'm looking at Stephen Graham Jones now.
The only one I read was World War Z.
I mean, because I think he did the job here. He did what I did.
Right. It has horror.
This is all. If you are looking at horror, it feels like you should look at this list. Yeah. And also, I'm looking at it like there are women on this list. Like this is where I would go if I wanted to try horror. Ellen Hildebrand, we just talked about. Jason Reynolds, we just talked about.
I will just point out everybody on Jason Reynolds' books. Heavy by Casey Lemon is one of my all-time favorite books. It is a terrific memoir. It was on the main list as well. It's great.
Oh, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is on Annette Gordon Reed's book.
What a book.
And that's another one I would have expected to get on that list, which is about, medical racism, but a tremendous read.
A tremendous read. Agree. Rebecca Roanhorse is where I first saw that book, The Only Good Indians, right? And then again, I think and then Louise Erdrich is on there, who I love. So
he did, and this, I don't know a lot of these books, right? And I think that's because I don't read sci-fi and fantasy.
Yeah. I will also point out, though, notably, she has a couple of different books of stories, which is also was like not as much on the main list. Marlon James.
You can tell Marlon James likes to be entertained when he reads.
Yeah.
These are all good reads.
Skippy Dies is one of those books a lot of people love, and it just did not land for me, but people really did love it.
I have never heard of this book as Meat Loves Salt, but I am going to read it because, first of all, I love that title. And also, I think this book, Marlon James's list feels like a list I would
right, you're just vibing with.
Now I trust that list.
Yeah, exactly.
Room is...
Again,
Roxane Gay's list. Room is a great read that should have been on the main list, I would think.
Yeah, agree. And
but don't you think some of this is also the same thing? It's like that book was really popular 15 years ago.
Like people just forgot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Recency bias.
That's why I like these ballots more than the actual
I think so.
list.
And Ann Patchett has never written a bad book. I like State of Wonder a lot.
Yeah.
Jonathan
Latham. I don't know really any of these books.
Me neither.
Sarah McLean, she's great. I read everything she recommends.
My book club was super impressed to know that your list was on there. They're like, which one was she? I was like, the one with the romance novels, everybody. I find her right away. So that was funny.
Riley Sager, also.
Beautiful Ruins. Remember how that was like the summer everybody was reading that book?
Yep.
That's a fun.
That's recency bias, I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
That was really recent. Seabiscuit. That's another one. Like, what a surprise! Yeah. Everybody read Seabiscuit when it came out, and now
right.
Yeah. This Is How You Lose the Time War is great, everyone, and romantic. Oh, and H is for Hawk is
And in third
one
person
of
present.
what?
I said, and in third person present, in case that's in for.
Oh, in case you want to know, not H is for Hawk. I was
No.
like, H is for
This
Hawk
Is How
is
You
not
Lose the
in third
Time War.
person present. H is for Hawk is a book that I read right after my dad died.
Yeah, people
And
love
it
that.
was,
Yeah.
and it is a book about grief. Like
Yeah.
it's a book that like, it is a memoir of this woman, like
Right.
her father dies and then she decides to like raise a hawk.
Yeah.
And it is very beautiful.
Bel Canto is a great book. I have
Yep.
I have a copy of The Swimmers, but I haven't read it yet. Maybe I'll move that up the list. That was from Ed Young's list. Pico Ayers list.
There's another Ishiguro on this list that I
Yeah.
haven't read. I haven't read The
I
Buried
haven't
Giant.
read that either.
Bringing Up the Bodies is Kate Claiborne's favorite Hilary Mantel.
Yeah.
Thomas Chatterton Williams.
2 Rachel Cusk books. I can't really jive with someone who thinks character isn't real, so I've always skipped her books. Sorry, I just have to be really honest with everybody.
Zadie Smith is great, by the way.
I haven't read that one,
If
though.
anybody has not read
Interesting.
Zadie Smith, you should.
Yeah.
Interesting that he put 2 Rachel Cusk. Is he married to Rachel Cusk? What's happening?
He also thinks character does not exist. What do I know?
Like, what? 10 books. Wait, I'm sorry. Point of order. 10 best books of 25 years and you put 2 by the same person? Come on now.
Wait until we get to Scott Turow. Okay. Of course, next.
What's interesting is so far not one Elena Ferrante on any of these books. What a weird reality.
Well, wait till you get to Scott Turow.
Hornby. This list, listen, this Nick Hornby's list, which is not what I would have expected Nick Hornby to make. Like it's very, aside from Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, and maybe Olive Kittredge, but like I will read every book on this list that he
On Beauty is
that
great.
I've not read because I love most of these books.
Billy Lynn, I've read Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. It was in the tournament of books one year, and I don't remember anything about it. So
wait, holy shit! Now I am looking at Scott Turow's list. Wasn't Elena Ferrante like? Is Scott Turow Elena Ferrante?
That's just for Elena Ferrante, said Scott Turow.
People may not know. If you don't know this, Elena Ferrante is like a big publishing mystery. Nobody knows who she is.
Don't we know who she is now?
Do we know who she is now?
I think at the time we didn't know, but now.
And it was like a big thing. She was like Italian. They were written in Italian and translated to English. Like nobody could understand. The covers are all like real bad. And like
I was telling somebody
they put romance to shame, these covers. And Scott Turow.
He's like, let me put 4 of the
Wait,
10.
Has anybody seen Scott Turow and Elena Ferrante in the same room together is the question that I
No, there is no way a man wrote Elena Ferrante's books.
No, there isn't, especially not Scott Turow, to be honest.
Yeah. Orphan Master Son, I loved it when I read it.
Maybe Scott Turow's like sister or
Daniel
child.
Yep. So yeah, these are.
Listen, Daniel Alarcon, 9 of his 10 hit the list, so he
clearly knew.
He has his finger on the pulse.
Yeah. Huh. Contributing writer at the New Yorker, of course. Okay.
That Bell Hooks book, Feminism is for Everybody, is great, and I gave it to my husband at one point to read.
Interesting. Okay. Listen, Stamped from the Beginning. I really learned a lot reading that book. Okay, let's see. Lucy Sante.
It Gets Me Home, This Curving Truck. I like that.
This curving
title.
Track.
This Curving Track.
Yeah. She also put the Sharon Noble book.
Anymore.
Let's see. Feral City. That's a good site. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great on finding liberation in lockdown. Yeah. This sounds cool. Mm-hmm. All right.
Some of these I'm like, okay. I've seen this book
listen, already. This next guy, Gary Steingart.
You're not into it?
No, I'm skipping that. Just
you're like, I'm skipping. I'm skipping the next person. They put a little life on it. So the next person, the rest of your ballots are no longer valid to me.
That's Jenna Bush, man.
But part of me too is like, okay, here's what I will say. Look, Jenna Bush.
Poetry has to be missing here too.
Yes. Jenna Bush has a very popular book club where she really reads a lot of like popular mainstream fiction. And yet her it's like a total try hard list. And meanwhile, these are great books. Homegoing. Now there is a book that should have been on the main list. What a read that was by Yagasai. Okay.
Whose list are you on?
I was still on Jenna Bush's. I was making fun of it, and then I had to dial it back
And you
because
had
she had
to
a great book. God damn
you
it.
agreed with her on something.
God damn it. Okay.
Alma Katsu put The Time Traveler's Wife on here. That's possibly the closest thing anybody has gotten to romance other than what I wrote. So there you go.
There you go.
Sarah Waters is great. All of her books are great.
Yeah.
I've not read this Donna Tartt. But I would read another Donna Tartt. It's fine.
Yeah.
I like that first one so much. She's like my Joanna Lindsay.
Megan Abbott has My Sister the Serial Killer on there, and that is a great read. But she also has a little life on there, so burr, burr.
Well, people were very moved by A Little Life, Jen.
Yeah, that's okay. Here's the book.
Wait, on there. More importantly, she has Joyce Carol Oates' Blonde, which
she has Lost Girls though, which is that unsolved American mystery by Robert Polker. That's a great book too.
I don't know that book.
It is it's basically like I think it's like in Long Island, like these bodies are discovered, and it tells the story essentially of trying to.
I love a book about bodies being discovered.
I do, as long as it is not romance, but fine.
Right. Okay, fine. Anna Napolitano, listen, 8 of the 10 are on the list. Mm-hmm. In fact, and I have read the other 6 of these 8, and I loved all of them. So I would read the others.
Yeah.
John Irving. Look, John Irving and I are in the same boat.
Oh, look.
See, we're both smoking cigarettes in the back of the class. Can I tell you something? I once met John Irving, and it was one of the greatest moments of my young life. I was not a writer at the time. I was just a person who really fucking loved A Prayer for Rowan Meany and Cider House Rules. And I cried at him, and he was so kind.
That's nice.
And he was a very, very nice man who was very kind to me, even though I cried at him. But actually, and you know, are you a James Salter fan?
I don't think I've ever read a book by James Salter.
I'm going to send you a James Salter book. They're so like humid. Like, they're just, James Salter he just writes. Love it. Anyway. Okay.
Jamie Attenberg has Just Kids by Patti Smith. What a great book that was.
Oh, there you go. The biography groups.
Yeah, right.
Fun Home, Alison Bechdel. If you are a graphic, that was the first time I ever that, and oh my God, the other one,
Persepolis, I'm sure.
Persepolis, yes. Yeah. Those 2 I read like back to back because I was trying to understand graphic novels, and they're both on the list.
I'll tell you, a lot of people recommend this book, Richard Powers, The Overstory, but I just do not have that much about trees in my life. I can't. There's no way. Cannot be done. I'm sorry, everyone.
They Were Her Property is a book that every white woman should read between now and the election. It is a brutal read, but you should all read it.
I read several of the books on Elizabeth Hane's list, but Just Kids, that Dan Shayan book, Ill Will, kind of fucked me up. It was like a little creepy. Same thing with that Sarah Waters book, The Little Stranger. Notably for me about that Sarah Waters book, The Little Stranger, it's like, you know, like these 2 people trying to like refurbish like this old estate. And I was like, oh, is this what happens to these Dukes houses?
Right.
Like you're just like saddling your future. You know what I mean? Oh, that's funny.
Dion Graham, I'm really proud of because apparently Dion only had 9 books to put on this list.
Know, here's my theory about that because I've seen a couple times is it did say at some point if the book was after 2000 or before, they just kicked it off. So I do wonder if some of these people with 9 accidentally had a 1998 book on there or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
I talked about Random Family already, but it's great. It's a great read. And there is a quote about it on the actual page about the book where it says, where the person who recommends it says, until I hate Random Family. It robbed us nonfiction writers of all our excuses.
Yeah.
It's easier for fiction writers to achieve that level of interiority until Random Family entered the chat.
Interesting. Yeah, I read that too.
And yeah, it's great.
Under Jeremy Denk, there's a book called A Little Devil in America by Hanif. I'm going to say his last name wrong, everybody. I'm sorry. Abner Rakab, I think. And I've seen him. I saw him in Hyde Park. He was with Eve Ewing. And I was just like, oh, he was such an awesome guy to listen to, really interesting. And he writes really interesting, like lots of different things. He wrote an entire book about how much he loves A Tribe Called Quest. He writes a lot about like Black popular culture in particular. And so if you're in, he like loves basketball, so he's really fun to follow on Twitter. He talks about basketball a lot on Twitter.
Cool.
Oh gosh, Morgan Jerkins has In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. I love that book. That is a great memoir. Michael Roth, president of Wesleyan University, Where Little Romance Goes. Fine.
Who else? Let's see. Wait, I lost my place.
Yeah, I'm just kind of scrolling now because here we are at the end.
Douglas Preston also writes mysteries and thrillers, and this is he's it's cute. You know what's cute? He sometimes writes books with Lincoln Child, and he put one of Lincoln's books on this list, and I respect it. I respect the loyalty.
You saw there's 2 books there by Hampton Sides, who writes a lot of really interesting nonfiction. I have not read The Wide, Wide Sea, but I have read Blood and Thunder. And I think Hampton Sides also maybe has written a book about like, anyway, if you're ever like, who writes great narrative nonfiction? There you go.
The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, which is on here, is really fun if you like the idea of like a Victorian detective story. And it is it's like what do they call it? Narrative nonfiction. Where it's basically like she has come back through the author comes back to this like specific murder case in England in the 1800s in the Victorian era. And then like she sort of like pieces it all together in like a fictionalized, it's both. Yeah. It's interesting how it's done.
Yeah. Well, and then it's funny because in the last one, which is Mary Roach, like that book, The Sister's Brother by Patrick DeWitt, I read that just like a weirdo book. I did really like it. And then Let the Great World Spin, which I don't know if you remember, like everybody was talking about that book.
No, I don't know that point.
Book. And well, it's part of the story of it is like the man who walks in between the Twin Towers. And I think it became like kind of a post 9. It was like the first.
It came back around.
It was like the first post 9/11 book. I remember thinking, this is a 9/11 book without it being about 9/11. That makes sense.
Yeah. Why Fish Don't Exist is the book I gave my father-in-law for Christmas this year. It's a biography of things, but also it's about about a marriage. It's really an interesting sort of like layering of nonfiction, of science, and of humans.
Well, yeah, I don't know, everybody. Like, look, obviously we're big romance readers, but like there's some great books on these lists.
Because romance readers read in addition too.
Yeah. So anyway, we will, I think, pursue our dreams of a best reads of the 21st century list and want to encourage everybody to get into that Discord and make your voice heard. Together, we will make an awesome list.
Anyway, so you can join us there on the Patreon. If you do that, you'll also get our monthly episode where we just do this, but like even more chaotic. And then you can also follow us on Instagram at FateMatesPod, on Threads at FateMatesPod, on Blue Sky and Tumblr, and on Twitter as well. I'm Sarah McLean. I'm here with my friend Jen Prokop. We are Fated Mates. If you really want to join us for Fated States phone banking, please feel free to do that. Join us at fadedmates.net/fadedstates. Thank you to our advertisers this week and every week. Their support of us makes it possible for us to bring this to you. And don't forget to check show notes where there will be links to all of this stuff. And what else, Jen? Is that it?
Have a great week, everybody. And remember to stick around. Right after the end of this episode, there's an audio excerpt of Danica Nava's The Truth According to Ember.
Chapter 1. I was not always a liar. I mean, sure, white lies were inevitable. I told them all the time. My habit of lying started with a simple, yes, that beady keychain is really pretty, to my best friend Joanna when we were 15. It was a vomit green lizard, and it was an insult to lizards everywhere. The keychain looked demented, all lumpy with gaps where beads should have been, but I lied through my teeth. What was I supposed to do? Tell her the truth and have her stop beating altogether? I couldn't do that to her. My little fib meant a lot to her, and I realized my words had an impact when she gifted the keychain to me that same Christmas with a little note that read, "Thank you for believing in me." That ugly little lizard, in all its garish glory, still lived on my keyring. It was so ugly, I was convinced that it could ward off evil. It was my little lucky charm and my most prized possession. Joanna ended up finding success with her beadwork. As the years went on, her ambitious designs served as a stable source of income, so I'd argue that my first white lie was a good one. Sometimes, I lied because it was just easier. Who had time to get into the weeds of things? Just a teensy tiny fib to save someone's feelings, or hide my own, did a lot to keep my sanity. I wasn't a pathological liar by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't like I would lie and say I was someone that I wasn't, and not everything I said was a whopper. I wasn't a con artist trying to pull one over on people. I was just Ember Lee Cardinal, a sometimes liar, but mostly an overall good person. But this lying business did get out of hand. I recognized that. I want to say for the record that if faced with the choice between plunging the toilets of an old and dingy, but well-loved, bowling alley for the rest of your life and the opportunity to dramatically change your circumstances with a few cleverly crafted lies, you would do it too. If an itty-bitty fabrication was the difference between barely keeping a roof over your head or having a stable career with growth, it was a no-brainer. I wasn't going to be slaving away disinfecting 15-year-old rental bowling shoes forever. Nope. I was changing my destiny. I was going to be an accountant. Not like the accountants going viral on TikTok, but a real number-crunching, invoice-consolidating, checkbook-balancing accountant for a company with a high salary. Not some job that paid $7.25 an hour, but a salary with benefits. No one in my family had ever had a salary before, and when we were sick, we would have to take a whole day off work and wait in line at the clinic, missing an entire day's pay. Private health insurance was on the table. Who was I? An accountant, that's who. Kind of. Accountant adjacent? I took an intro to accounting class at the community college. It was enough to get an entry-level job, I knew that. And somehow, I still couldn't land any job interviews. I'd put in so many applications and gotten zilch in return. That was how I ended up here. Desperation makes good people do bad things. "Order 19!" I yelled over the crashing sound of the bowling balls rolling down the freshly waxed pine lanes, knocking down pins. "Not a single interview request?" Joanna, my best friend, roommate, and coworker asked as she dumped a new jar of pickled jalapenos into the black Cambro for our patrons. I handed the artificial nacho cheese-covered chips to 2 teenagers on a date. It smelled like burnt rubber. We probably should have stopped selling it today, but Bobby Dean was cheap. "Not since you asked me this morning," I grumbled. She meant well. Joanna was an artist, and this gig at Bobby Dean's bowling alley was perfect for her creative schedule. She made extra cash selling her jewelry, and she was so talented that sometimes people bought her stuff straight off her ears. It didn't hurt that she was smoking hot, with her dark hair cropped to her shoulders, with vibrant purple ends standing out against her tan skin. I, on the other hand, was not artistically inclined. My earning more money would take my leaving this place and getting a real career. I like numbers and security, so accounting seemed like the best choice. How many rejections is that then? 20? She wasn't looking at me as she wiped up some of the jalapeno brine off the counter. 37, I corrected, and wished to Creator that I was kidding. I had a teacher once who told me if I applied myself, I could go far. I did apply myself. Quite literally, I applied to every job I could find online. I received 37 rejections, all iterations of the same email. We regret to inform you that we have reviewed your application and decided to go with a candidate who would be a better fit. What did that even mean? These were entry-level jobs that paid a few dollars more an hour than what I was making in the bowling alley. With every rejection, it was getting harder to believe they weren't auto-rejecting my application because I sounded like I came straight off the reservation. Which I did. My name was a pretty common Okie name. My high school was in Ada, right in the middle of Indian country. But I felt like those shitasses hadn't even bothered reading my application or my cover letter. I was honest, mostly. I wanted to learn and grow. Did any of that matter? Not when you were Indian, apparently. Something we could call ourselves, but rubbed us the wrong way when non-natives tried to foist the inaccurate label onto us. Joanna cried. And there it was, the pity, the tone of, why are you doing this? The cry of outrage for putting myself in this type of situation. I rolled my eyes, bracing myself for the same conversation I'd had a million times. It's going to be fine, I said, and before she could try to convince me to give up, I walked off to start refilling the napkin dispensers. She followed me around the counter, dodging a few men and their beers. I was shoving the tiny napkins into one of the silver dispensers when Joanna pushed the others away and invaded my space, leaning against the counter, casual confidence in all her indigenous glory. Each of her fingers had a silver and gemstone ring, and her wrists were stacked with beaded bracelets that jingled as she tapped her chin in thought, drawing attention to her full lips. She was tall and commanding and didn't take shit from anybody, including me. I believe you. You are always the smartest kid in our classes, and you've been dealt some shitty hands. Why don't you wait to apply for these jobs until you finish more of the accounting classes? She asked. I need to be making more money now to pay for those classes? Sarcasm laced my voice as I mimicked her casual stance. I could give you a loan. Her exaggerated tone put mine to shame. No, it's not your fault that... Stop. Talking about the rejections I could handle. I was not going to get into it again about my brother Sage and the reason I was broke. Joanna knew, and I knew, that he'd lost my money. Talking more about it wouldn't help me right now. I needed forward-moving action. I reached around her to grab one of the discarded napkin holders. Okay, I'm sorry. I just want to help you. I know, I sighed, and punched the napkins into their place harder than was needed. All this would be easier if I was white. Why would you say something stupid like that? I said it to be flippant, but lights and bells went off in my head like a jackpot win at the slots in the casino. Ding, ding, ding. There was a possible solution to my problems. Joanna! We have to be proud of who we are and where we come from. Don't buy into the colonizers' propaganda. Yeah, I grabbed her shoulders. Listen to me. The napkins and customers around us were forgotten. Fuck's sake, what? I'm just gonna be white. Your dad is white. She looked beyond confused. Exactly, so it's not really a lie. I'm just going to check the Caucasian box on the applications. Does that really matter? Let's see. You also don't have any accounting experience on your resume. She extracted my hands from her. So what? I do all the register balancing here, and I help you and my auntie with your online taxes. Joanna's face brightened. She finally understood where my mind was at. I can be your reference. Her smile lit up my entire world. Some people have private bookkeepers to handle all their business stuff. You're hired. Now, it's not technically a lie. This is brilliant. Why didn't I think of this before? Because you are playing as if the game was fair. Everyone lies on their resume. Play by everyone else's rules. Joanna was excited, and it was infectious. You know, she continued, we are the only ones who answer the phone around here. You can be the bookkeeper for Bobby Dean, too. I can also be your reference here. With that last bit, she did her impression of Bobby Dean himself, with his lazy oaky twang. It was a perfect match. So, I'm doing this then? You're doing it! We squealed and hugged. A rough and insistent tap on my shoulder reminded me that I was still at work. I turned around to see Bucky, one of our regulars. He played in the Little Bighorns Bowling League of old retired Native men who thought Bobby Dean's with the $3 beer was the best place to spend most of their time. Their team name was totally a dick joke that no one but them thought was clever. None of them were Lakota. Toilets backed up again. Bucky burped and used his thumb to point behind him toward the men's bathroom. I watched Bucky make his way back to his buddies, dragging toilet paper that was stuck to the bottom of his shoe. It's your turn, Joanna said, and walked back around the counter. I didn't care. With my new application strategy, this was going to be the last clogged toilet I was going to plunge at the bowling alley.